I couldn't explain what drew me to the house on Barnum Street. Maybe it was the way the morning sun glimmered off the cracked windows, or the crooked porch that sagged like it held secrets. It was a place forgotten by time, standing still while the world spun forward. I was desperate for a new beginning, and this place felt like the end of the road I was looking for. The real estate agent gave a nervous laugh when she handed me the keys, brushing away a cobweb from the doorframe. "Not many people want to live here," she'd said, her eyes darting toward the faded street sign. "But it's a quiet neighborhood, perfect for solitude. Solitude. That's exactly what I needed. No judging eyes, no whispered accusations, just silence and space to forget." The floorboards creaked under my boots as I stepped inside for the first time. The air was stale, carrying a faint hint of something sweet, like burnt caramel or cotton candy left too long in the sun. The smell clung to the walls and to my clothes, stubborn and unwelcome. The rooms were empty, but the house felt full, as if memories were still lingering here, watching from the shadows. I shook the feeling off. I was just tired. The drive from the city had been long, the weight of my past hanging heavy on my shoulders. By the time the sun began to set, I had unpacked just enough to survive the night. A mattress on the floor, a box of clothes, and my favorite lamp, the one with the warm, amber glow that made any space feel a little more like home. I didn't need more than that. I didn't deserve more than that. As night swallowed the street outside, the silence settled in, the kind of quiet that made your ears strain for something, anything, to break it. I tried to convince myself it was peaceful, but my heart wouldn't slow down. My hands felt cold. I sat by the window, looking out at the dimly lit street. The streetlights flickered, casting long, crooked shadows. That's when I saw them. Figures. They emerged from the dark corners of the street, where the light couldn't reach. Tall, slender forms with stiff movements. Their clothes were faded and worn, splashes of muted reds and blues. They drifted slowly, like ghosts unsure of their purpose. Their faces were the worst part, pale and waxy, with wide eyes and frozen smiles. Clowns. They walked in unison, step after step, and I couldn't look away. My breath caught in my throat as they turned toward my house. The lead clown raised a gloved hand, fingers curling toward the porch. A sickening chill raced down my spine. I blinked. They were gone. I slammed the curtains shut, my hands trembling. It had to be exhaustion playing tricks on me. Maybe my mind was slipping again, weaving illusions out of my fears. I took a deep breath, forcing the tightness in my chest to ease. "It's just stress, Amelia. Just stress." The floor creaked behind me. My heart jumped into my throat and I spun around. Nothing. Just shadows stretching along the wooden floor, reaching out like grasping fingers. I laughed, a weak, hollow sound. "You're losing it." But even as I spoke, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Something was here, hiding just out of sight. I grabbed my lamp, clutching it like a lifeline, and headed to the bedroom. I needed sleep. Everything would look different in the morning. The lamp's warm glow painted the walls with comfort, chasing away the darkness. I curled up on the mattress, wrapping the thin blanket tight around me. My eyes stayed open, scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. But there was only silence. Maybe tomorrow will be better. But as I drifted off, that sweet, cloying smell of burnt sugar crept back into my nose, suffocating and sickly. And somewhere in the distance, I thought I heard the faint sound of laughter, high-pitched and broken, like a clown forgotten in the dark. I woke up to the sharp bite of cold air, the kind that creeps through cracks in old houses. The blanket was tangled around my legs, damp with sweat. My head throbbed, and for a moment, I couldn't remember where I was. Then I saw the peeling wallpaper, the dim glow of the lamps still on the floor beside me, and it all came back. Barnum Street. The clowns. The laughter. I shook my head. "Just a dream," I whispered to the empty room. But the tightness in my chest wouldn't let go. I pulled on a sweater and walked to the kitchen, the floorboards groaning under my feet like they were sharing a secret. The old pipes sputtered before a weak stream of cold water filled my glass. The liquid felt sharp as it slid down my throat. I turned to the window above the sink. The morning light was pale and hesitant, barely touching the street outside. Everything looked normal, too normal. The quiet was thicker than it should have been, like the world was holding its breath. Then I noticed something strange. The street, which had seemed quaint yesterday, was eerily empty. No cars, no people, no sounds of life. Just rows of dilapidated houses with sagging porches and windows like hollow eyes. The breeze stirred the dead leaves, sending them skittering along the cracked pavement. A shiver ran through me. I looked down at my feet, at the faint trail of dirt and leaves I must have tracked in the night before. But the trail didn't stop at the door. It continued into the living room, leading straight to the window where I had seen the clowns. I leaned in closer. There, on the wooden floor, was something that made my stomach twist. Faint smudges, like footprints. But they weren't mine. The marks were too large, and the shapes were strange. Rounded toes with deep impressions, as if someone had been wearing oversized shoes. My hands began to shake. No, I muttered. I'm imagining this. I grabbed a dishcloth and scrubbed at the marks. They smeared and faded, but they didn't disappear entirely. The wood seemed stained, as if the prints had sunk beneath the surface. I swallowed hard and forced myself to stop. There had to be an explanation. There had to be. I needed to get out of the house. Grabbing my keys, I stepped outside. The cold air felt like a slap to the face, but I welcomed it. I needed to clear my mind to breathe something other than the suffocating stillness of the house. The street was empty, the silence almost oppressive. My footsteps echoed unnaturally, like the sound was trapped between the rows of forgotten homes. I glanced around, hoping to see a neighbor, a car, a bird, anything to break the monotony. But there was nothing. I walked to the end of the block, my eyes scanning every window, every shadow. It felt like I was being watched, like the houses themselves were leaning in to listen. A faded sign creaked on its rusted hinges. Barnum Street, Historic District, established 1903. Something about the date nagged at me. I pushed the thought away and turned back. That's when I saw it. A figure stood on my porch facing the front door, the same waxy white face, the same faded costume, the same stiff posture. A clown. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't move, couldn't look away. The clown's head tilted slowly, unnaturally, as if it were listening for something. Then, just as slowly, it turned to face me. Its eyes were hollow pits, its painted-on smile a grotesque slash of red. My knees locked. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my feet were rooted to the pavement. The clown lifted its hand and pointed a gloved finger at me. I stumbled back, heart hammering against my ribs. Blinking hard, I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. But when I looked again, it was gone. Just an empty porch, the front door slightly ajar, like it was inviting me back inside. My hands were ice cold. I took a shaky step forward, then another. I climbed the porch steps, each creak echoing like a gunshot. My fingers brushed the doorknob, but I hesitated. Inside, the air was heavy with that same sickly sweet smell of burnt sugar. The house felt darker, smaller, like the walls were closing in. I pushed the door open fully and stepped inside. The floor was clean, the footprints were gone, the curtains swayed gently, though there was no breeze. But as I closed the door behind me, I caught a glimpse of something in the hallway mirror, a shadow, just a flicker, moving behind me. I spun around, nothing. The silence stretched, tight and suffocating. My reflection stared back at me, eyes wide and unblinking. The reflection's smile was just a little too wide, just a little too red, and then it moved. The smile twisted higher, splitting the pale face open like a wound. The glass cracked, the crack in the mirror spider-webbed outward, thin lines splintering the reflection of my face. I couldn't move. My breath came in shallow gasps as my reflection's grotesque smile widened, impossibly stretched, like the face of a clown carved out of porcelain. The house felt alive now, its walls pulsing with an unseen heartbeat. The air grew colder, tighter. I turned away from the mirror, clenching my fists to stop the tremors that ran up my arms. I had to get out. I had to escape, but my feet wouldn't move. Something whispered through the hall, a high-pitched, broken laugh that made my skin crawl. I turned slowly, dread building in my gut. There, standing in the doorway to the living room, were three figures. Clowns. Their eyes were hollow, black voids, their painted faces twisted in expressions of silent suffering. The colors of their costumes were faded, the reds resembling dried blood, the whites like decayed bone. They stared at me, unmoving, yet I felt them accusing me. They knew. A strangled sob escaped my throat. "Please, leave me alone," I choked out, my voice cracking. The lead clown stepped forward, one oversized shoe landing with a muffled thud. He raised a gloved hand, pointing past me, toward the hallway mirror. I didn't want to turn around. My muscles ached from fear, my mind begging me to run, but something deep inside whispered that there was nowhere to run, that I had to see. I forced my body to turn, facing the cracked glass. My reflection was still there, but it wasn't me anymore. The glass showed a different scene now, not my living room, but a foggy, desolate road. A curve in the road lit by a single flickering street lamp. The pavement was slick with rain. My heart hammered in my chest as the memory clawed its way to the surface. The sharp turn, the squeal of tires, the sickening thud. The world spun as I gripped the sides of the mirror, the cold glass biting into my fingertips. I saw it all. The dark shapes sprawled on the ground. The blood smeared on the pavement, mixing with the rain. Their painted faces twisted in shock and pain. The clowns, the performers who had been walking home after a long night at the fair. And me, sitting in my car, frozen in panic, my hands trembling on the steering wheel, the taste of copper in my mouth from where I had bitten my lip, the air filled with the smell of burnt rubber and something sweet, cotton candy. I had wanted to help. I had wanted to get out of the car, to call for help. But instead, I pressed my foot to the gas pedal and disappeared into the darkness, leaving them behind. I squeezed my eyes shut, but the images were burned into my mind. The guilt I had buried for so long surged up, choking me. I stumbled back, away from the mirror. The clowns still stood in the doorway, their hollow eyes locked onto me. "I'm sorry," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. I didn't mean to. I was scared. I didn't know what to do. But they didn't move. They didn't forgive. The walls around me began to dissolve, like smoke unraveling in the wind. The wallpaper peeled away, revealing blackened wood and decay. The floor sagged beneath my feet. The house was disintegrating, collapsing under the weight of its own darkness. The street outside flickered like an image on an old film reel, distorting, twisting. The buildings crumbled to dust. The sign that read Barnum Street vanished in a swirl of shadows. It had never been real. None of it. The house, the street, the clowns, it was all a prison of my own making. My mind's way of punishing me for what I'd done. I fell to my knees as the last fragments of the illusion evaporated. The ground beneath me was cold and wet. I looked up and saw the real world, a foggy roadside, littered with dead leaves and broken branches. My car sat a few yards away, like its headlights still on, casting weak beams through the mist. I was back where it had happened, the place I had tried so hard to forget. I closed my eyes, the weight of my guilt pressing down on me. The whispers were gone. The clowns were gone. All that was left was the truth. I didn't know if I could forgive myself. Maybe I never would. But as I stood, the cold morning air filling my lungs, I knew one thing. It was time to stop running. Time to face the consequences. To find the families I had wronged and tell them the truth. To give the ghosts I had created a chance to rest. The fog began to lift, and for the first time in what felt like years, I took a step forward. Into the light. I leaned back in the creaking chair, the smell of stale coffee filling my nostrils. The Blackwood Gazette office was almost silent, except for the hum of the fluorescent lights and the occasional rustle of paper. I stared at the corkboard in front of me, covered in photographs of missing children. 8 faces, 8 lives gone without a trace. My fingers tapped against my coffee mug, the rhythm a poor distraction from the weight pressing down on my chest. Tommy Jenkins, age 8. Abigail Moore, age 7. Caleb Simmons, age 9. The list went on. The town was small, tight-knit, the kind of place where everyone knew each other's names and secrets, or at least they thought they did. But now fear threaded through Blackwood like poison. The kind of fear that made parents clutch their kids' hands tighter, that made people avoid looking at the empty playgrounds. The kind of fear that whispered, "You could be next." I picked up the latest flyer. Hannah Reeves, age 6. Her face smiled up at me, frozen in time. 2 days ago, she'd been playing outside with her brother. He'd turned his back for a moment, and when he looked again, she was gone. No screams, no signs of struggle, just gone. A chill crawled up my spine. I knew what people were saying, that maybe the kids had wandered off, gotten lost in the woods. But all of them, and all within a few weeks? It didn't add up. None of it did. I rubbed my eyes, exhaustion gnawing at the edges of my mind. I needed a lead, a clue, something to explain the madness that had gripped our town. My gaze wandered back to the photos, to their wide, innocent eyes staring at me, and then I saw it. Pinned in the corner of the board was a crumpled piece of paper I didn't remember tacking up. The edges were smudged with dirt, the ink slightly smeared. I leaned in closer. The Grand Silent Night Circus, one night only. A wave of unease settled in my stomach. The image beneath the text was of a clown, his grotesquely cheerful, his eyes black pits. His mouth was stitched closed with thick, black thread. I flipped the paper over, nothing on the back, no address, no contact information, just a date. Tonight. A cold draft slipped through the office window, making the blinds clatter. I grabbed my jacket, the leather cool against my fingers. Every nerve in my body buzzed with an urgency I couldn't explain. I didn't believe in coincidences, and something about this circus felt wrong. Too wrong. I stepped outside, the sun dipping below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gray and rust. Blackwood's streets were unusually quiet for a Friday evening. Shops were closing early, their owners avoiding eye contact as they turned their keys. The few people walking kept their heads down, their movements stiff with anxiety. I slid into my car, the engine coughing to life. The flyer sat on the passenger seat, the clown's stitched smile taunting me. I didn't know where this circus was, but something told me it wouldn't be hard to find. The town faded behind me as I crossed the old bridge leading to the outskirts. The fields stretched out on either side, empty and dark, the wind whispering secrets through the tall grass. I rolled the window down, trying to shake off the claustrophobic feeling that had settled in my chest. Then I saw it, a faint glow on the horizon where there shouldn't be anything but fields. Lights, but not the kind that welcomed. These were pale, flickering, almost sickly. My foot pressed harder on the gas. As I got closer, the shape of a tent emerged, massive and black, its surface seeming to absorb the remaining light of the evening. No colorful banners, no cheerful music, just that looming structure waiting in the dark. A line of people stretched toward the entrance, their faces blank, eyes glassy. Children clung to their parents' hands, their expressions vacant, like they were already somewhere far away. I parked the car on the gravel shoulder, my heart pounding. The air was colder here, biting through my jacket and seeping into my bones. I took a deep breath, my breath fogging in front of me. As I approached the entrance, I realized something that made my blood run cold. There was no sound, no laughter, no conversation, no footsteps crunching on the grass. Just a silence so complete it felt like the world had stopped breathing. A figure moved near the entrance, tall, thin, dressed in a worn ringmaster's coat. His face was pale, his eyes shrouded by the brim of his top hat. He raised his gloved hand and gestured for me to enter, his movements slow and deliberate. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to turn around. But behind me was the darkness of Blackwood, filled with unanswered questions and the empty eyes of the children I couldn't forget. I stepped into the tent, and the silence swallowed me whole. The moment I stepped inside the tent, the air seemed to thicken, wrapping around me like a shroud. The silence was even more suffocating here, pressing down on my ears until my own heartbeat felt deafening. The dim, cold light cast everything in shadows, the flickering bulbs above barely holding back the darkness. Rows of people filled the seats, their faces pale and expressionless. It was like they were carved from wax, frozen in a state of anticipation. The children sat with wide, glassy eyes, hands clutching the arms of their chairs. No one whispered, no one moved. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. The tent felt alive, like a giant lung slowly inhaling and exhaling around me. My gaze fell to the center ring. A lone spotlight shone down, illuminating a figure standing perfectly still. The clown. Tall and skeletal, his costume a patchwork of faded reds and blues. His face was painted a sickly white, the makeup cracked and peeling around the edges, black pits where his eyes should be, his lips sewn shut with thick black thread twisted into a grotesque smile. He moved, a slow, jerking motion, like his limbs were being pulled by invisible strings. He raised one gloved hand and gestured toward the audience, his fingers curling in a way that sent a chill down my spine. A shudder ran through me, but I couldn't look away. His movements were hypnotic, pulling me deeper into the quiet horror of it all. Then the performance began. Other clowns shuffled into the ring, their costumes faded and stained. They danced, if you could call it dancing, with stiff, unnatural grace. Their heads lolled to the side, their limbs bending at odd angles. They moved like marionettes whose strings were tangled, jerked along by a cruel puppeteer. My stomach twisted. There was something wrong with them. Their eyes were too wide, too vacant. As I watched, realization crashed into me like a wave of ice. These weren't just performers, these were children. I recognized their eyes. The same innocent, terrified eyes that stared out from the missing posters pinned to my office wall. Tommy Jenkins, Abigail Moore, Caleb Simmons. They were all here, trapped behind those hollow expressions and painted smiles. I gripped the edge of my seat, my knuckles turning white. This couldn't be real. My mind was playing tricks on me. It had to be. But the more I watched, the clearer it became. The clowns were the missing children, their bodies twisted into grotesque parodies of joy. I felt bile rise in my throat. I needed to get out of here, to find help, to stop whatever nightmare was unfolding in this place. But my legs wouldn't move. I turned to the person sitting next to me, a woman with dull eyes and a blank face. "We have to do something," I whispered, my voice trembling. "These are our kids." She didn't react, didn't blink. It was like she hadn't heard me at all. Panic clawed at my chest. I was alone in a crowd of shadows, surrounded by people who were no longer people. I forced myself to stand. My legs shook as I backed away from the ring, the clown's silent performance continuing, their movements growing more erratic, more tortured. The lead clown's black eyes locked onto mine. He raised his hand again, this time pointing directly at me. My breath caught in my throat. The spotlight swung toward me, its harsh glare blinding. The rows of faces turned in unison, their heads snapping around like dolls. Hundreds of empty eyes stared at me, unblinking. A cold dread settled deep in my bones. I had to leave. Now. I turned and stumbled toward the exit, the silence ringing in my ears. The tent felt endless, the flap I'd entered through now a distant point of darkness. My footsteps were soundless, absorbed by the heavy air. Then I felt it, a presence behind me. I glanced over my shoulder, my heart seizing in terror. The ringmaster. He stood in the shadows just beyond the spotlight, his tall frame cloaked in black, his face obscured by the brim of his hat. But I could feel his eyes, cold and sharp, drilling into me. "Leaving so soon, Miss Lane?" His voice was a whisper that cut through the silence, threading into my mind like smoke. My knees buckled, and I grabbed onto a nearby chair to steady myself. "How do you know my name?" I whispered. The ringmaster stepped forward, his polished boots soundless on the sawdust floor. The flickering lights cast deep shadows across his face, but his smile was unmistakable, a cruel, knowing grin. "You've been asking questions, digging where you shouldn't. We've been expecting you." He raised a gloved hand, and I felt a pressure around my wrists and ankles, like invisible ropes were binding me. Panic surged through my veins, my body frozen in place. "You're just in time for the finale," he said, his voice silk smooth and poisonous. "Tonight's special performance," he paused, that dreadful smile widening, "is you." My vision blurred, the edges of the tent folding inward. The clowns stopped their grotesque dance, their hollow eyes fixed on me, their bodies twitching in anticipation. The darkness crept closer. The ringmaster's smile, the last thing I saw before the world went black. My eyes snapped open. Darkness enveloped me, thick and suffocating. My limbs felt heavy, as though they were weighed down by invisible chains. The air was damp, filled with the faint scent of mildew and something metallic, like rust or blood. Panic rose in my chest as I struggled to move, but my body refused to obey. A cold, sharp voice pierced the silence. "Welcome to the show, Miss Lane," the ringmaster. His voice slithered through the shadows, wrapping around my mind like a vice. A dim light flickered to life above me, illuminating the space in a weak, sickly glow. I was lying on a hard wooden surface, my wrists and ankles bound by thick, coarse rope. The light was just enough to reveal the edges of the stage beneath me. I wasn't in the audience anymore. I was in the ring. A slow, rhythmic sound filled the air, a soft thud like footsteps on damp ground. I turned my head to see the ringmaster emerging from the shadows, his top hat casting a jagged shadow over his face. His eyes gleamed like shards of black glass. He smiled, and I saw the glint of sharp teeth behind his lips. "You've been so curious, haven't you?" he whispered, poking and prodding, asking questions that no one else dared to ask. "But curiosity, my dear, has a price." He snapped his fingers. A wave of cold air swept over me, and suddenly, they were there. The clowns. They stood at the edges of the ring, their painted faces twisted into eerie masks. Their hollow eyes stared at me, filled with a silent, pleading desperation. I knew those eyes. Tommy, Abigail, Caleb, Hannah. Their souls were trapped, twisted into these grotesque forms. My heart broke as they took slow, jerky steps forward, their limbs moving like marionettes on strings. I struggled against the ropes, the fibers biting into my skin. "You don't have to do this," I shouted, my voice cracking. "Let them go. They're just children." The ringmaster laughed, a sound that echoed like breaking glass. "Oh, but they are performers now, and they love to perform." He leaned in closer, his cold breath brushing against my cheek. "And tonight you're going to join them." "No," I screamed, my voice tearing from my throat. "Please don't." But my words were drowned out by a surge of silence so powerful it like my ears would burst. The clowns moved in closer, their hands reaching out, fingers curled like claws. I saw tears streaming down their painted cheeks, their mouths trembling beneath their stitched-on smiles. They didn't want to do this. They were prisoners, just like I was about to be. I clenched my jaw, rage and terror swirling together inside me. I couldn't let this happen. I couldn't let him win. The ringmaster raised his arms, his long fingers spread wide. And now, the grand transformation. A cold wind whipped through the tent, and the lights flickered wildly. I felt the pressure on my limbs increase, like invisible strings were wrapping around my joints, pulling, twisting. My vision blurred, my body stiffening as if I were turning to stone. No, not like this. I forced my mind to focus, to fight the overwhelming numbness creeping through my veins. The ringmaster's voice grew louder, chanting words I couldn't understand, his eyes burning with cruel delight. Then I saw it. The ropes binding my wrists were frayed, just enough for a chance. With every ounce of strength I had left, I wrenched my arm free. Pain shot through my shoulder, but I ignored it. My hand flew to the pocket of my jacket, where I'd tucked away a small penknife. My fingers fumbled, slick with sweat, but I managed to flick the blade open. The ringmaster's eyes widened, surprise flashing across his face. I didn't hesitate. I sliced through the rope binding my other wrist, then hacked at the ones around my ankles. The moment I was free, I rolled off the platform, hitting the ground hard. The impact knocked the wind out of me, but adrenaline surged, pushing me to my feet. The clowns hesitated, their hollow eyes flickering with confusion. "Run!" I screamed at them. "You can fight him! Break free!" For a moment, nothing happened. Then, like a dam breaking, the clowns turned on the ringmaster. Their stiff bodies moved with a new determination, their hands clawing at the man who had enslaved them. The ringmaster's face twisted in fury. "No," he roared. "You belong to me." But it was too late. The children's anger, their pain, gave them strength. They tore at him, their painted faces contorted with a mixture of vengeance and grief. The tent began to collapse around us, the darkness swallowing everything. I grabbed Tommy's hand, pulling him toward the exit. The other children followed, their movements becoming smoother, more human, as if the curse was losing its grip. We burst out into the cold night air, the tent behind us imploding into a swirl of shadows and screams. The ringmaster's roar of rage was cut off abruptly, replaced by an eerie silence. And then it was gone. The tent, the circus, the nightmare. We stood in the empty field, the stars above us cold and distant. The children clung to me, their eyes wide and confused. Tears filled my own eyes as I whispered, "You're safe now, you're free." In the distance, sirens wailed, growing louder. Help was coming, but for now, we stood together in the darkness, survivors of a show that no one else would ever believe. And I prayed that the curtain had fallen on the silent circus for good. When we first pulled up to the old house, it loomed over us like a sleeping giant. The late afternoon sun bled gold and crimson over the faded wooden siding and the gabled roof, and for a moment I wondered if we'd made a mistake. The house had been in the Hartman family for over a century, left to me by an uncle I barely remembered. It wasn't what I'd call welcoming, but after years in the city, it was supposed to be a fresh start. David parked the car, glancing at me with a reassuring smile. "Looks better than the photos, right?" I managed a weak laugh. "Sure, if you squint." From the back seat, Leo's excitement was palpable. He bounced in his booster seat, his eyes wide as he took in the towering structure. "Is this our new house, Mommy?" he asked, his voice tinged with awe. "Yes, sweetheart," I said, trying to sound enthusiastic. "This is it." Sophie, on the other hand, slumped lower in her seat, thumbs flying over her phone. "This place looks haunted," she muttered. David shot her a look. "Come on, Soph, give it a chance." We stepped out of the car, gravel crunching beneath our feet. The porch sagged slightly, the paint peeling away in long curls. The windows stared back at us, smudged and dull, reflecting nothing but shadows. I took a deep breath and turned the key in the lock. The front door creaked open, revealing the dim interior. Dust motes swirled in the slanted light coming through the curtains, and the air smelled of old wood and something faintly metallic. "Welcome home," I whispered, more to myself than anyone else. Leo dashed in ahead of us, his sneakers thumping on the hardwood floors. His laughter echoed through the empty rooms, filling the silence with a sense of innocence I desperately wanted to hold on to. Sophie followed behind, her eyes glued to her screen, barely acknowledging the space around her. I ran my fingers along the banister of the staircase, the wood smooth and cold. Memories I didn't recognize stirred within me. Fragments of stories told at family gatherings, whispers of tragedies that had haunted the Hartman name for generations. I shook off the feeling and reminded myself that this was just an old house, nothing more. David carried in the last of the boxes, setting them down with a satisfied sigh. "I'll start bringing things up to the bedrooms," he said. "Leo, want to help me pick yours?" Leo didn't answer. I glanced around, my stomach tightening. "Leo?" A muffled thump came from above. I looked up to see the attic door, slightly ajar, the pull-down ladder extended. My heart skipped a beat. "Leo!" I called, my voice sharper than I intended. He poked his head out, a grin spreading across his face. "Mommy, you have to see this!" His blonde hair was mussed, and his cheeks were flushed with excitement. I climbed the creaking steps, each one groaning under my weight. The attic was dim, lit only by the slanted rays filtering through the dusty windows. Boxes and old furniture lay scattered like forgotten memories. Leo stood beside an old wooden trunk, its surface scuffed and marked with deep scratches. He'd managed to pry it open, the lid yawning like a mouth ready to swallow us whole. "Look," he said, pulling out a tangled mess of fabric. "Costumes!" I stepped closer, my skin prickling. In his small hands, he held a crumpled clown costume. Oversized, faded red and white stripes and a ruffled collar stained dark. A faint, metallic scent clung to the fabric. Something else was in the trunk, too. A wig, wild tufts of orange hair matted together, a pair of oversized shoes, the leather cracked and peeling. My stomach twisted. There was a patch of darkness on the costume, like dried blood. "Leo, put that back," I said, my voice tight. "But it's funny," he insisted, pulling the wig over his head. He grinned up at me, the orange hair framing his face in wild chaos. "Do you think it belonged to a real clown?" I forced a smile, trying to push away the unease. "Maybe. But it's dirty. Let's leave it alone, okay?" He pouted but nodded, dropping the wig back into the trunk. I closed the lid with a heavy thud, dust puffing out around us. Something about the air felt colder now. "Come on," I said, holding out my hand. "Let's go find your room." Leo took my hand, his fingers warm in mine, and we climbed back down. I turned to pull the attic door closed, but for a brief second, I thought I saw something move in the shadows, a flicker of color, like the hem of a clown's costume. I blinked, and it was gone. The attic door snapped shut with a final hollow sound. The first night in the new house was colder than I expected. The old pipes groaned, and the wind whispered through cracks in the walls. I curled up under the blankets, trying to shake off the lingering unease from the attic. Next to me, David was already asleep, his steady breathing a comforting rhythm. But I couldn't sleep. My mind kept drifting back to that trunk in the attic, to the dark stain on the clown costume and the faint, metallic scent. I told myself it was just an old piece of clothing, something forgotten and harmless. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. The shadows in that room felt alive. I turned over, staring at the ceiling, when a sound made my heart stop. A soft, lilting giggle. It was faint, almost blending with the creaks of the house, but it was unmistakable. A child's laugh, muffled and distant. I sat up, straining to hear more. The giggle faded, replaced by silence so thick it felt suffocating. I glanced at the clock on the nightstand, 2:17 a.m. Maybe it was just Leo, I thought, though the chill in my bones told me otherwise. I slipped out of bed, the floor icy beneath my feet. Moving carefully so I wouldn't wake David, I padded down the hallway to Leo's room. His door was ajar, the soft glow of his nightlight spilling into the hallway. I peeked inside. Leo was curled up in his bed, his chest rising and falling in the deep rhythm of sleep. The blankets were tangled around his legs, his toy dinosaur clutched tightly in one hand. I let out a breath, relief washing over me, but then I saw it. In the corner of the room, where the light barely reached, a shadow shifted. My heart pounded as my eyes adjusted. For a moment, I thought it was just a pile of stuffed animals. But the shape was wrong. Too tall, too rigid. And then I saw the faintest glimmer of white, like painted skin. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The shape didn't move, didn't breathe, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching me. I forced myself to blink, and the shape was gone. The corner was empty, just a shadow cast by the dresser. I shook my head. Sleep deprivation. Stress. That's all it was. I backed out of the room and quietly closed the door, my fingers trembling. I was halfway back to my bedroom when I heard it again. The giggle, louder this time, playful, taunting. It came from upstairs. I turned toward the attic door at the end of the hallway. The pull cord dangled from the ceiling, swaying slightly. Glad though there was no draft. My stomach twisted into knots. The house felt colder. The silence pressed against my ears, thick and expectant. Every instinct told me to go back to bed, to pretend I hadn't heard anything. But I couldn't. My feet carried me forward, one slow step at a time. I reached out and grasped the cord, the rough string biting into my palm. With a deep breath, I pulled. The attic ladder unfolded with a groan that echoed through the house. The smell of dust and cold air wafted down. I hesitated, then climbed the steps, each one creaking beneath my weight. The attic was just as we'd left it. Dark. Still. The faint moonlight filtered through the cracks in the roof, casting long, twisted shadows across the floor. The old furniture sat draped in sheets, ghostly shapes waiting in silence. But something was different. The trunk was open again. My heart thudded painfully as I approached. The lid was pushed back, revealing the clown costume inside. The orange wig lay sprawled on top of the fabric like a nest of tangled snakes. The stain on the costume looked darker, wetter, like it had seeped deeper into the fabric. And beside the trunk, something new. A small red ball. A clown's nose. It hadn't been there before. The giggle bubbled up again, this time right behind me. The sound was soft, warm breath against my ear. I spun around, my scream trapped in my throat. The attic was empty, but the air felt charged, like a storm was about to break. My skin prickled, and I backed away, bumping into the trunk. The wood was ice cold against my legs. "Mommy?" I jumped. Leo's voice, soft and sleepy, drifted up from the bottom of the attic stairs. I rushed to him, scooping him into my arms. He rubbed his eyes, his hair tousled. "Why are you in the attic, Mommy?" he asked with a yawn. I forced a smile. "Just checking on something, sweetheart. Let's get you back to bed." As I carried him downstairs, he rested his head on my shoulder. Just as I was about to close the attic door, he whispered, "You forgot to say goodnight to Mr. Chuckles." A cold knot formed in my stomach. "Who's Mr. Chuckles, Leo?" He lifted his head, his eyes half closed. "The funny man from the attic. He likes to play games." My hands shook as I pulled the ladder up and shut the attic door, the latch clicking into place. I held Leo tighter, his warm weight a fragile comfort against the chill spreading through me. Mr. Chuckles. I didn't remember any funny men in the attic. Leo's words burrowed into my mind like splinters. Mr. Chuckles. The funny man from the attic. The giggling, the shadow in the corner. My thoughts spun in dizzying circles as I carried Leo back to his room and tucked him in. His eyelids fluttered shut almost immediately. His breathing slow and peaceful, but peace was the last thing I felt. I closed his door softly and leaned against the wall, my heart hammering in my chest. I couldn't ignore it anymore. There was something wrong with this house, with that attic, with the damn trunk. And whatever it was, it had found my son. I took a deep breath and walked back toward the attic door. My fingers grazed the pull cord, my mind a storm of fear and determination. I couldn't let this thing, this Mr. Chuckles, have any power over my family. With a swift pull, the ladder unfolded again, the creaking sound sending chills down my spine. The attic loomed above, an open maw waiting to swallow me whole, but I couldn't turn back now. I climbed the steps, each creak echoing in the stillness. The air grew colder the higher I went. When I reached the top, I hesitated. The attic felt heavier, darker. The familiar shapes of covered furniture loomed like silent witnesses. And there, in the center of it all, the trunk sat wide open. A faint light spilled from within, like a dying ember. The clown costume was gone. In its place was a photo album, one I hadn't seen before. My hands trembled as I reached for it, the leather cover brittle under my fingertips. I flipped it open. The first photo showed a man standing with his arm around a young boy. The man's face was obscured by thick makeup and a painted smile. The boy's face was clear, his eyes wide and trusting. He looked like Leo. I turned the page, another photo. The same clown, the same painted smile, this time with a teenage girl. Her eyes were hollow, her lips twisted in a forced grin. Page after page, the photos continued. Different children, different generations. But the clown was always there, a constant presence lurking behind their smiles. My breath caught when I reached the final page. It was my family, me, David, Sophie, and Leo. We were standing on the porch of this house. But the clown was there too, just behind Leo, his white painted face grinning wickedly. His hand rested on Leo's shoulder like a claim. A sharp chill ran down my spine, my eyes blurred with tears. How had we not noticed? How had we missed that shadow clinging to us? A soft, mocking giggle echoed through the attic. I spun around, the photo album slipping from my hands and thudding onto the floor. In the shadows, a figure unfolded itself, stepping into the dim light. Mr. Chuckles. He was tall and gaunt, his costume tattered and stained. The ruffled collar was streaked with brownish red, and his painted smile was cracked and peeling. His eyes were pits of darkness, endless and hungry. "Why so serious, Emily?" he whispered, his voice a raspy croon. "Don't you want to play?" My blood turned to ice. He knew my name. He knew us. He had always known us. He took a step forward, his shoes scraping the floorboards. I backed away, my foot catching on the edge of a box. "Stay away from my family," I managed to say, my voice trembling. He tilted his head, his painted smile widening. "But they're my family too now." I glanced down at the open trunk. A thought sparked in my mind. He came from there. The trunk was his prison. Maybe it could trap him again. I lunged for the trunk, grabbing the heavy lid. Mr. Chuckles' laughter turned into a snarl. "No!" he bellowed, his voice echoing like a storm. He surged forward, his claw-like hands reaching for me. But I gritted my teeth, using every ounce of strength to slam the lid shut. The instant it closed, a deafening roar filled the attic. The trunk shuddered violently, as if something inside was clawing to get out. Then, silence. I collapsed to my knees, gasping for breath. The air felt clearer, the cold dissipating. The weight that had hung over the attic lifted like a storm passing. I stared at the trunk, my hands shaking. The wood was still now, the scratches and scuffs, a silent testimony to what had been sealed within. It was over. I didn't know how long I sat there, my mind a haze of exhaustion and disbelief. Finally, I stood and descended the ladder, closing the attic door behind me. Leo's door was ajar. I peeked inside. He was still sleeping peacefully, the shadows in the room soft and harmless. I pressed a kiss to his forehead, whispering, "You're safe now." As I walked back to my room, a sense of relief washed over me. The nightmare was over. Mr. Chuckles was trapped again, and this time I'd make sure he stayed that way. But just as I climbed into bed, I heard a faint sound, a giggle, so soft it could have been the wind, or a whisper from the dark. The wind rattled the windows, a hollow sound that echoed through the empty house. I set down my whiskey glass, the ice clinking softly. The room was dimly lit by the glow from the street lamp outside, casting long, jagged shadows on the walls. My eyes flicked toward the clock on the mantel, 11:58 p.m. I leaned back in the armchair, exhaling a slow breath. The days were blending together lately. Work, drinks, avoidance. That was the pattern. Karen barely spoke to me anymore, and when she did, it was polite, measured, as if she were talking to a stranger, not her husband. Maybe that's exactly what I'd become. I glanced at my phone. A message from her blinked back at me. "Hope you're okay. Let me know if you need to talk." I swiped the screen off, the guilt like a stone in my gut. The clock struck midnight, 3 sharp metallic chimes. I closed my eyes, willing sleep to come. But then I heard it. A sound so faint, so out of place that for a moment I thought it was just my imagination. A soft thud. I sat up, the hairs on the back of my neck prickling. My gaze drifted to the front door, where a faint shadow stretched across the floor. My chest tightened. There was someone, or something, standing on my porch. I rose slowly, the floorboards creaking beneath my feet. The whiskey burned in my throat as I swallowed, my pulse quickening. I hesitated at the door, my hand hovering over the doorknob. Through the frosted glass panel, I could make out a shape. Tall, unmoving. A strange chill seeped through the door, even though it was early spring. I took a breath and, with a trembling hand, unlocked it. The latch clicked softly. I pulled the door open just a crack and peered outside. The street lamp's glow revealed him. A clown. He was standing perfectly still on my front porch. His costume was faded red and white, like a ruffled collar drooping around his neck. His painted face was cracked, the white makeup peeling away like dried plaster. His eyes were ringed in black, his lips twisted into a grotesque smile. He didn't move, didn't blink. I stared at him, my mind racing. Was this some kind of prank? A drunk in a costume? But no, there was something wrong about him. Something hollow. Lifeless. "Hey," I croaked out, my voice dry. "What do you want?" He said nothing. The wind whistled through the trees, but the clown's hair, bright orange tufts sticking out like brittle straw, didn't move. The longer I stared, the more my stomach twisted. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my fingers fumbling over the deadbolt. I leaned against the door, my breath coming out in short bursts. "Jesus Christ," I whispered. I waited, heart pounding, expecting a knock. A voice. Anything. But there was only silence. Minutes ticked by. Finally, I crept back to the window, my hands clammy. I pulled the curtain back just enough to see the porch. He was still there, just standing, waiting. I let the curtain fall and stumbled back. This was crazy. I was seeing things. Maybe it was the alcohol or the lack of sleep. Maybe it was guilt gnawing at the edges of my sanity. But when I looked again, he was still there, his presence as solid as the ground beneath my feet. I sank into the armchair, hands gripping the whiskey glass so tightly I thought it would shatter. I needed to calm down, to think. By the time the first light of dawn crept into the room, my eyes were raw, my mind foggy. I forced myself to stand, knees stiff. I hesitated for a moment before opening the door. The porch was empty. The clown was gone. I let out a breath, my chest loosening slightly. Maybe it was just a hallucination. A weird trick of the mind brought on by exhaustion and too much alcohol. I stepped out onto the porch, the morning air cold and damp. Nothing. Just the empty street and the sound of birds waking up. I rubbed my face, relief washing over me. I needed sleep. A clear head. Maybe I'd talk to Karen, try to fix things. But as I turned back to the house, I noticed something on the doormat. A small white card. I bent down and picked it up, my fingers trembling. Scrawled in red ink were 3 words, "See you tonight." I sat at the kitchen table, the card between my fingers. The red ink seemed to pulse, the words searing into my mind. "See you tonight." My coffee had gone cold, the bitter taste clinging to my tongue. Sunlight streamed through the window, illuminating the room in harsh clarity, but it didn't chase away the chill settled in my bones. I tried to convince myself it was a prank, someone messing with me. But who would do that? And why? I ran my thumb over the card's surface. The paper felt damp, almost clammy, like it had absorbed the morning dew. I crumpled it in my fist and tossed it in the trash, the sound too loud in the empty kitchen. The clock on the wall ticked relentlessly. 8:42 a.m. I was supposed to be at work. I should have been getting ready, focusing on spreadsheets, sales calls, and emails, but none of that seemed real anymore. The only thing that felt real was the memory of that clown's painted smile, the hollow eyes that stared without blinking. My phone buzzed on the table. I glanced at the screen. Karen. I hesitated before answering. "Hello?" Her voice was clipped, businesslike. "Hey, just wanted to let you know I'll be late tonight. Another session ran over." "Okay," I replied, my voice hollow. "See you later." There was a pause. The silence between us felt heavier than usual. "Everything all right, Michael?" she finally asked, her tone softening just a fraction. I wanted to tell her, to spill the strange horror that had unfolded the past 2 nights, but the words stuck in my throat. How do you tell your wife, who already thinks you're a failure, that a clown keeps appearing on your doorstep at midnight? "I'm fine," I lied. "Just tired." "All right. Take care." She said, the warmth gone. The line went dead. I dropped the phone and buried my face in my hands. My thoughts spiraled, a whirlpool of dread and confusion. I couldn't shake the feeling that things were slipping through my fingers, unraveling thread by thread. Get a grip, Michael, I told myself. It was just a prank. But deep down, I didn't believe that. The day dragged on in a haze of useless attempts at normalcy. I went to work, answered emails, and half listened in meetings. My colleagues' voices were a distant murmur, their faces blurred and indistinct. I nodded when I was supposed to, pretended to care, but the weight in my chest grew heavier with each passing hour. By the time I got home, the sky was a bruised purple, the sun sinking low behind the trees. The house was dark, the silence inside pressing down on me. I flicked on the lights, the glow weak and insufficient. I made myself a drink, just one to take the edge off, and sank onto the couch. The minutes crawled by. The ticking of the clock seemed louder than usual, like a countdown. 11:50 p.m. I stared at the door, my heart pounding in rhythm with the second hand. My palms were damp, my mouth dry. A sick part of me wanted to fling the door open and confront whatever was out there. Another part wanted to barricade it shut and hide under the covers like a child. The clock struck midnight. 3 metallic chimes. I held my breath. The house was deathly silent. For a moment, nothing happened. Then came the sound. A soft, deliberate thud, like a footstep on the porch. I stood, legs trembling, and walked to the door. My hand hovered over the knob, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I didn't want to look, but I had to look. I pulled back the curtain just an inch. He was there. The clown stood on the porch, the same vacant eyes and painted smile. But this time something was different. His head tilted slightly, like he was studying me. The red and white of his costume seemed brighter under the moonlight, and a faint shimmer of moisture clung to the fabric. He lifted his gloved hand and tapped one finger against his temple, a slow, mocking gesture. Then he pointed at me. I staggered back, the curtain falling closed. My chest heaved, panic clawing at my lungs. I couldn't think, couldn't breathe. The walls of the house felt like they were closing in. I needed air. I needed to get away. I grabbed my jacket and bolted out the back door, the cold night air slapping me in the face. My feet pounded the pavement as I ran, not knowing where I was going, only that I had to get away from him. I didn't stop until I reached the end of the block, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I leaned against a street lamp, the metal cold against my forehead. My heart thundered in my chest, every beat a painful reminder that I was still here, still trapped in this nightmare. When I finally looked back at my house, the porch was empty. The clown was gone. But the relief was short-lived, because when I turned to head home, I caught a glimpse of something in the reflection of the street lamp, a flash of red and white. I spun around, my stomach lurching. The clown was standing in the middle of the street, closer now, waiting. His smile seemed to widen, stretching across his face like an open wound. And then, without moving his legs, he leaned forward, just an inch, just enough to let me know that he could come closer anytime he wanted. I turned and ran home, slamming the door behind me. My hands shook as I locked every bolt, every latch, but I knew it wouldn't matter, because now he wasn't just outside my door, he was inside my mind. I don't remember how long I sat on the floor, my back pressed against the door, knees pulled to my chest. The house was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the street lamp filtering through the curtains. My breath came in ragged gasps, my mind spiraling into a whirlpool of fear and confusion. I was trapped. The clown wasn't just on my doorstep anymore. He was in my thoughts, woven into the fabric of my reality. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that twisted smile, those hollow eyes. I glanced at the clock, 2:17 a.m. The minutes were slipping away, but time had lost all meaning. My head throbbed, my throat was dry. The whiskey sat untouched on the coffee table, its amber glow mocking me. I couldn't drown this out anymore. Whatever this was, it was deeper than fear, deeper than reality. It was something inside me. A whisper slid through the darkness, cold and brittle. Liar. My body went rigid. The voice wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from the hallway. I turned my head slowly, dread crawling up my spine. The hallway stretched out before me, the shadows thick and suffocating. And there, standing at the far end, was the clown. His painted smile gleamed in the dark, cracked and peeling. His eyes glistened with something darker than hate. He took a step forward, his shoes scraping the floor with a sickening squeal. "You can't run from me, Michael." His voice was a rasping hiss like dead leaves scraping against pavement. My chest tightened, panic clawing at my ribs. I scrambled to my feet, my hands shaking. "What do you want from me?" I shouted, my voice cracking. The clown tilted his head, his grin stretching wider. "You know what I want." He took another step, his body twitching like a puppet on fraying strings. "I'm you. I'm everything you've tried to bury. Every lie, every betrayal. You fed me, and now I'm hungry." I stumbled backward, the walls closing in. The memories came flooding back. The late nights, the excuses, the hollow promises I made to Karen, to myself. The messages I sent, the drinks I had to numb the guilt. I thought I could ignore it all, hide it away. But the lies had grown teeth, and now they were coming for me. "No," I whispered, tears stinging my eyes. "This isn't real. You're not real." The clown laughed, a dry, brittle sound. "I'm as real as your lies, Michael." He lunged forward, his gloved hand shooting out, his fingers cold and claw-like. I fell backward, crashing into the coffee table. The glass of whiskey shattered, amber liquid soaking into the carpet. The room spun, the edges of my vision blurring. He loomed over me, his face inches from mine. The smell of decayed sugar and rust filled my nose. His eyes bored into me, endless voids of darkness. "Face me, or let me consume you." My lungs burned, my heart pounded. I wanted to run, to hide, but there was nowhere left to go. I was cornered, not just by him, but by myself, by the weight of everything I had tried to deny. I clenched my fists, my nails digging into my palms. "No more running," I whispered. I pushed myself up, my knees shaking, and met his eyes. The terror clawed at my throat, but I swallowed it down. I forced myself to remember every lie, every betrayal, the guilt, the shame. I let it all rise to the surface, boiling over like a storm. "You're right," I said, my voice trembling. "I lied. I betrayed people I loved. I hid from the truth, but I won't hide anymore." The clown's smile faltered. A flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. "I see you now," I said, my voice growing stronger. "You're not real. You're just the part of me I refuse to face, and I'm done letting you control me." The clown's form began to waver, the edges of his figure blurring like smoke. His eyes widened, the void inside them fracturing. "No," he hissed, his voice splintering. "You need me. You made me. I don't need you anymore," I said, standing taller. "I'm taking back my life." A guttural scream tore from his throat, the sound vibrating through the walls. His body convulsed, his painted face cracking like porcelain. Pieces of him began to flake away, dissolving into dust. I watched as he disintegrated, the twisted smile shattering, the darkness in his eyes splintering into nothingness. The air grew lighter, the shadows receded, and then he was gone. Nothing left but silence and the faint scent of decay. I collapsed onto the couch, my body trembling. The house was still, the only sound my ragged breathing. The weight in my chest had lifted, replaced by a hollow ache. I didn't know if I was free, not entirely, but I had faced him, faced myself. And maybe that was enough to start over. The first rays of dawn seeped through the windows, casting pale light across the wreckage of the night. I closed my eyes, exhaustion pulling me under. When I woke hours later, the house was quiet. I stood and walked to the front door. The porch was empty, no clown, no shadows lurking in the corners. Just the crisp morning air. I took a deep breath and stepped outside. The world felt sharper, clearer. The weight of my secrets was still there, but it was mine to carry now, not his. As I closed the door behind me, I noticed something on the welcome mat. A single piece of torn white fabric smeared with red. A reminder. But this time, it didn't scare me. It was just a scrap from a nightmare I had finally left behind.